The M14 sucks. Or does it? The incestuous bastard child of the greatest battle implement ever devised, the M14 has gained a reputation as possibly the worst battle rifle ever produced. An uncontrollable, inaccurate, and woefully outdated weapon that was kept alive more for its political merits than its battlefield ones. What began as a project to improve the nigh flawless M1 Garand ballooned into a decade-long black hole of ideologically charged arms development that, when all was said and done, produced the shortest-serving standard-issue rifle in American history. But, as evidenced by its continued usage through to today, there is clearly some value to the M14 design, and maybe that bad reputation isn't quite all it's often chalked up to be. So what exactly led to the creation of the M14 as we know it? How did the child of the venerable M1 gain such a poor reputation? And why does the M14 remain in use over 60 years after it was cancelled? Before we begin, I need to make something quite clear. This is not a comprehensive, all-encompassing history of the M14. This is my best effort to distill that history into an easily digestible format, but I could have easily made this video several hours long. As such, I'd like to direct you to the sources in the description. If this interests you at all, I implore you to explore this topic for yourself, as there is just so much more dense, fascinating history to learn than just what I'll cover here. That said, without further ado, let's jump into how the M14 came to be.
The U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1, commonly known as the Garand, is not only a dependable weapon, it also has a terrific wallop, better known as firepower.
Even as the M1 Garand ascended to its now legendary status as the so-called greatest battle implement ever devised, it was understood that the rifle wasn't perfect. In fact, for much of the war, the engineering staff at the famed Springfield Armory were hard at work resolving the Garand's tendency to freeze when wet, and by the time the atomic dust had settled in 1945, more than a dozen different experimental Garand variants had been created. In the midst of the grueling grind to victory, the chief of the Army Ordnance's Small Arms Research and Development Wing, one Colonel Rene Studler, came up with a brilliant idea. Develop a singular, lighter, M1-derived rifle featuring a detachable box magazine and selective fire capability to supplant all infantry arms then in use. Essentially, it was an attempt to combine the best features of all American infantry weapons into a single platform. While it might seem a bit silly today, this one rifle to rule them all was genuinely seen as the future, and it's not hard to see why. The world of firearms was rapidly changing, with the emergence of fanciful new rifles like the STG-44 and FG-42. Rifles which, on paper at least, offered almost exactly what Studler was looking for. The Americans wanted in, so a formal request for such a weapon was issued by the Ordnance Technical Committee in September 1944, starting life as a 9-pound paratrooper rifle with a shortened barrel, folding stock, and a bipod. Two projects were soon authorized for this task, a Springfield-designed weapon called the T-20 and one contracted to Remington called the T-22. With limited time and an even more limited budget, the quest for the second coming of the Garand commenced over the next year, with John Garand himself heading development of the T-20. His new rifle was anything but. It was basically just an M1 Garand modified to accept BAR magazines, as well as having an external mechanism to permit automatic fire. After a few revisions to this design, including the cancellation of the impractical folding stock and short barrel, Garand's T-20E2 was recommended for procurement as the M2 rifle in May 1945. However, the end of the war soon saw these plans reduced to atoms. Although it had swiftly proceeded to the brink of adoption, the T-20E2 was about as fit for the battlefield as a blind paraplegic. It was literally just an automatic M1. Firing the powerful 30-06 cartridge accurately and effectively from a 12-pound full-auto rifle was a fantasy at best. In addition to the unsurprisingly brutal recoil and muzzle blast, the wooden frames of the T-20s were becoming charred from sustained fire. But with the fascist empires being deservedly crushed, the pressure to rush the T-20E2 into service had dissipated. The Americans now had room to more completely develop a new rifle, as well as finding a cartridge a bit better suited to the task at hand. As for Remington, well, their program saw limited success with their T-22 and later T-27, but both were dropped by 1948. Colonel Studler was confident nonetheless that with more time and research, a single weapon and cartridge package would be the future for all American infantrymen, and for the next decade, this belief would drive American rifle developments under the so-called lightweight rifle program. American rifle development from the mid-40s to the late 60s is a complex and fascinating saga, and to fully understand why things unfolded the way they did, it's imperative to first discuss the culture within Springfield Armory and the Ordnance Department as a whole. I cannot stress this enough though, this culture is not reflective of the Army at large, and in fact, much of the Army heavily disagreed with the trail ordnance was soon to blaze. Anyway, these two entities, in particular their small arms development sectors, had been and remained bastions of conservatism in firearm design ever since their founding in the early days of the Union. Even the legendary M1 Garand was derided as too radical and unproducible by them when it first arrived, and when the search for new rifles began in the wake of World War II, they already had a concrete notion of what a rifle, and by extension its ammunition, was supposed to be like, a notion deeply rooted in World War I and II era warfare. So resistant to change were these two entities that there was even a faction that vehemently fought against the use of detachable magazines for the new rifle well into the 1960s. In turn, there also existed a prevalent idea of American superiority. Big surprise, I know. Foreign-made weapons often found themselves stigmatized as lesser simply because, well, it wasn't made here, irrespective of what advantages it may offer. There is a legitimate practical explanation for this stigma though. It's not exactly ideal to adopt a foreign weapon if you can't adequately build it yourself. Furthermore, in the post-war period, hot on the heels of their successes birthing the M1 carbine, M3 grease gun, and M18 and M20 recoilless rifles, Studler's R&D department had enormous influence when it came to new infantry arms, and they didn't let that go to waste. Although it should be noted that infantry arms were barely an afterthought at this time. The US military felt that nukes had rendered men on the battlefield practically obsolete, and was dumping most of its resources into perfecting atomic engagements, so no one really cared what ordnance did so long as it didn't eat into the nuclear budget too much or cause a scandal. So with that said, when Studler and Springfield begin looking for a new rifle and cartridge, rather than the newfangled assault rifles being pursued by Europe and the Soviet Union, what they're really looking for are only minor deviations from the principles behind the M1 and its .30 caliber cartridge. An if it ain't broke, don't fix it kinda logic. Critically though, they are solidly entrenched on their ideas, and stateside, they have an immense amount of power to ensure they get the weapon they want. So when the hats of their European allies came flying into the ring, there were major, fundamental disagreements almost immediately. It's at this point that we can finally discuss the search for a new cartridge, because this is where shit truly starts hitting the fan, and then doesn't stop for over a decade. You see, during the war, the Allied nations were using dozens of different weapons with almost as many different cartridges, a predicament that produced a horrendous logistical nightmare that no one wanted to experience ever again. Even before NATO officially formed, it was clear that the Western Allies needed to adopt a common cartridge to reduce logistical strain, and the search began as the Cold War kicked off. The key European players in this search for what at the time was meant to be a standardized NATO cartridge and rifle were the British and Belgians, and all the evidence they had pointed to a .280 caliber cartridge that could offer more control, greater versatility, and higher capacity, while sacrificing minimal range and power. As you might imagine, the Americans, and the .30 caliber fundamentalists particularly, did not take too kindly to this evidence-based suggestion. So heretical was this to the Yanks that when the British presented them with their studies into the so-called ideal caliber in 1947, they were effectively shouted out of the room. Their main concern was the range. US doctrine still envisioned most battles taking place beyond 500 yards, and 280 just didn't have the stopping power at those distances. Stoodler and his underlings were adamant that nothing less than .30 caliber was sufficient. So instead of even giving a smidge of consideration to the Europeans, they covered their ears, pretended they weren't there, and continued to forge ahead with their own cartridge, known as the T65. Based on the 300 Savage round, it had been in development since 1944 and offered near identical ballistics to the 30-06, but shaved off about half an inch in length. In the grand scheme of ammunition, it really wasn't much of a difference, but it satisfied the narrow-minded 30 cal true believers at Springfield, and somewhat more importantly, it was a big fuck you to the Europors. For now, Europe would stick with their 280-based developments, while in the States, the 30-06 programs were pushed aside and all efforts were channeled into developing a new weapon built around the T65. Now, given the way this tale began, and where you know it ends up, this is probably where you'd expect Stoodler to dump every available cent and second into developing a Garand-derived T65 chambered rifle. And you'd be absolutely wrong! Verily, until the early 1950s, only one engineer was working on such a weapon, with whatever leftover scraps of funding he could scrounge together. But we'll get to that later. Instead, much of the support and attention for a new rifle went to Stoodler's pet project, an innovative design from one Earl Harvey. Harvey had first been recruited to Springfield by Stoodler in 1941 to experiment with different gas systems for the Garand, and in March 1945 he was directed to develop a new, selective-fire, magazine-fed rifle to succeed the M1. It was to fire the T65, weigh no more than 7 pounds, replace practically all American small arms, and be easy to produce even in a nuclear war. While Harvey was very understandably skeptical about its viability, he nonetheless pursued what would be named the T25. Over the next 3 years, Harvey's rifle blossomed from a funky idea into a genuinely pioneering prototype that was, in his own words, the best shot at a new rifle to satiate the .30 caliber fundamentalists. His T25 used a novel inline stock to better manage the powerful recoil, unique flip-up sights, and a gas cutoff and expansion system, a system he'd adapted from a Joseph White patent for a previous wartime Garand variant. It was truly an impeccably engineered design, and when it was first tested in January 1948, it was a resounding success. Well, in everything except automatic fire. Given it was still firing a .30 caliber cartridge from a rifle that weighs less than my cat, controlling it in full auto was pretty hopeless, and Harvey himself felt that the weight and cartridge requirements were incompatible. Stoodler was unfazed, however, ordering the production of a limited number of T25s following more successful tests in April and May. But that institutional conservatism reared its head once more. The T25 was derided, as the M1 had once been, as too radical and unproducible by much of Springfield, and, ironically, the M1 was now considered the Armory's standard for what qualified as an acceptable rifle. Internal roadblocks to Stoodler's plans meant these rifles ultimately weren't delivered until April 1950, but by that time, the Colonel was already in another world of shit. You see, Stoodler was still heavily playing favourites towards his pet project, so much so that he had attempted to push the rifle into troop trials, something typically done after a rifle was adopted. The Brits had caught wind of this, and enraged at the lack of
parliamentary procedure here, right? Oh, God.
Demanded that if a decision was to be made on a new rifle and cartridge, a fair and international competition was of the utmost importance. Since NATO was meant to be finding a common rifle and cartridge, it was reasonably feared that the US, as the de facto leader, would just force their choice on everyone else. But the British, already angered that their developments were being ignored, weren't going to allow themselves and their continental comrades to be so blatantly sidelined. Studler was reluctantly forced to agree to the testing, and for the first time since the 1920s, the US would trial international competitors to its homegrown designs. The Colonel's efforts to rapidly ram his favoured design into service had been politically stonewalled, and as the lightweight rifle trials unfolded into the 1950s, the competition became as much about those politics as it was about the rifles themselves. The 1950 lightweight rifle trials are a significant moment in the story of the M14, and much of that is down to the implications these trials carried. Studler's department entered the trial having spent the last 5 years outright rejecting any consideration of foreign-made candidates, and should their chosen rifle be anything less than exceptional, not only would Studler's credibility be thrown into question, so too would the entirety of the American lightweight rifle program. As for the Europeans, they had something to prove. NATO was set on adopting a universal intermediate cartridge, and this was a chance for the European 280 round to finally get some kind of recognition from the star-spangled superpower. Starting in February and May respectively, Aberdeen Proving Grounds and Fort Benning tested the 30 cal American T25 against the 280 chambered futuristic British EM2 bullpup and an early model of the now iconic Belgian FN FAL, and the results were inconclusive. All the rifles had some kind of advantage over the others. The EM2 was the best in extreme conditions testing and automatic fire, the FAL in endurance, time to disassemble and firing when wet, and the T25 in semi-auto accuracy and rifle grenade firing. Although, to the surprise of no one, the T25 with its 30 cal round was infinitely harder to control in full auto compared to the European rifles. All in all, there was no clear winner, and all the rifles were recommended for further development. It was disappointing for everyone to say the least. But politically, Studler's department had shit the bed. For years, Studler and Springfield had hid behind the supposed self-evident superiority of their 30 caliber project, but reality had shown that it really wasn't, much to the embarrassment of the American military machine. Worse still, some in the army even began voicing support for the FAL, much to Studler's chagrin. Even so, the T25 remained the clear frontrunner from the US, for now, but a stern message from above made it clear to Studler that a major revamp of the rifle was in order. The illusion was broken. The Colonel could no longer railroad his pet project into going all the way, so to cover for any more potential embarrassments, the decision was finally made to give another American rifle program some more attention. While a beleaguered Harvey returned to the drawing board, in a small corner of the Springfield R&D department was a single man, toiling away with a box of scraps since the mid-40s to create a competitor to the T25, a Garand-derived rifle to fire the T65 round. His name was Lloyd Corbett, and the rifle he was building was soon to become the T44. Earl Harvey's T25 was Springfield's golden child, the firstborn, the heir to the throne, and consequently the inheritor of pretty much all the funding available for a new rifle program. But while the T25 was championed by Studler in the post-war period, the program to develop a new rifle directly from the M1 Garand kept on barely limping alongside it. Following the war, John Garand himself had continued some limited experiments with the T20E2, in addition to his innovative T31 bullpup. However, in 1947, Studler ordered the aforementioned Mr. Corbett to experiment with rechambering the Garand action to fire the T65, and for the next 5-ish years, he was the only engineer assigned to the project. By no means was it the only project competing with the T25. There was also the T28, Garand's T31, and the T33, which, while interesting, were never strong contenders, but warranted at least a mention. Anyways, Corbett's first stab at the problem was the T35, literally just an M1 Garand rechambered for the T65 round and featuring a new barrel, which emerged in late 1948. It wasn't even really a contender, more just a proof that the standard US service weapons could be converted to the new cartridge. But it worked and was just as accurate as the M1, though much less reliable. Concurrently, Corbett had also been working on a rechambered T-20E2, which would arrive in November 1949. Designated the T-36, the rifle featured the T-35's new barrel and some elements of Remington's T-22E2, such as its flash hider. There isn't really much to say about this model, but it was soon developed further into the T-37, though for a time it bore the name T-36 Lightened or T-36½. As the name suggests, it was a lightened and shortened T-36, also incorporating Harvey's T-25 magazine along with some minor changes to the bolt, receiver, and trigger. This makeshift Franken rifle is where Corbett was at when the politically devastating 1950 trials occurred, and the mid-performance of the T-25 gave his largely ignored developments a fresh injection of life, predominantly as it was the only Springfield project that could actually serve as a viable fallback. Still short on funding, Corbett made the wise decision to just combine the best of his rifle with Harvey's. I mean, he already had the magazine, so what's a few other parts? The key upgrade to the T-37 was the borrowing of Harvey's adapted gas cutoff and expansion system to replace the original Garand one, and the weapon that resulted was designated the T-44 in January 1951. But make no mistake, the majority of its components were still common with the OG M1. Within a year, the neglected second-born was directly competing with Studler's favourite son. So let's check back in on the T-25 to see what was going on in the wake of the 1950 trials. In the months following the embarrassing 1950 trials, Harvey had quickly gotten to work revamping his T-25, resulting in the T-25E1 by December 1950. It was a fair departure from the original, abandoning the forward-thinking inline stock for a traditional drop-heel design, along with more orthodox sights replacing the flip-up ones. Built and tested over the summer of 1951, Harvey's rifle performed well enough that this experimental model was officially designated the T-47 in October. The T-47 was hardly a miraculous turnaround, however. Testing of the rifle still showed that it had serious issues functioning in extreme conditions, and the growing number of bumps in the road was sowing doubts in Colonel Studler's mind. He recalled the years of testing and countless dollars to resolve the M1's issues, and the T-47 was shaping up to potentially be a much more dire repeat of that. It was a new and largely untested design that could take many more years to perfect, but a Garand-derived rifle, say the T-44, should already have most of that work ironed out. Harvey sensed the winds of change were coming. He continued to plead for more time and money to develop his T-47, determined he could make it work, but both were in short supply. As his rifle entered another round of testing in the early months of 1952, this time directly against the burgeoning T-44, the once golden child was looking more like a golden calf. And again, it struggled dearly with extreme conditions testing. Time was running out. The Belgians and British were already set to return in August for new trials with improved versions of their rifles, and another embarrassing failure of Ordnance's favoured contender was not an option. Studler's pet project was crumbling around him. What had once been paraded as the future of American infantry arms had become an expensive, increasingly unpopular, and still unreliable weapon with no end in sight for its completion. Conversely, the backup T-44, further improved after testing against the T-47, offered a battle-proven basic design. But crucially, it was the only other acceptable weapon, and there just wasn't the funding or time to build something else. Pretty much all military resources were still being directed into nuclear weapons, and the small budget left over for a new rifle had been squandered on the floundering T-47. The headstrong colonel was between a rock and a hard place. He needed a lightweight rifle to outperform the foreigners, or his career and credibility would be in jeopardy, and his all-in gamble on the T-47 had left him with severely limited options. Seeing the writing on the wall, he very bravely chose to throw Harvey and his rifle under the bus. But how do you suddenly cancel your pet project that you've championed for 7 years without looking like a complete muppet? Well, with those new international trials set for August 1952, a dastardly plan was hatched. Another dismal display of the T-47 would be a perfect excuse to drop the rifle in favour of the T-44 without any major backlash, so Stoodler did his best to ensure that that happened. From early 1952 onwards, the T-47's cash flow was cut off, greatly reducing the chances Harvey could fix his rifle, while Corbett's T-44 finally received some substantial funding, rather than just some occasional kind words and a pat on the back. The stage was set for Stoodler to quietly kill off the T-47 and sneakily place the hitherto neglected T-44 on the throne instead. But even so, the testing wouldn't go exactly as planned. Over 2 years had passed since the first round of inconclusive testing, but now the 1952 tests would prove much more definitive. Again at Fort Benning and Aberdeen Proving Grounds, from August to December, the condemned T-47 competed against its usurper in the T-44, along with a much improved T-65 chambered FAL and a now drowning EM-2, which was being dragged down by its own domestic politics. As it relates to the NATO search for a standard cartridge, it's often rumoured that around this time, Winston Churchill brokered a kind of backroom deal with Harry Truman. NATO would adopt the American-made T-65 round if they would adopt Europe's favoured rifle, the Belgian design from FN. But as we shall soon see, only one part of that will actually materialise. Back to the trials themselves though, the Belgians saw them as their chance to finally convince the Americans of their rifle, and when the gunsmoke had cleared, it looked like they had. Announced in April 1953, the rankings of the trials were as follows. FAL at number 1, the T-44 in second, and the OG M1 Garand snatching third, while the T-47 and EM-2 were rejected as unsuitable, and were to receive no further consideration. Despite successfully killing it off, the T-47's failure hadn't been as decisive as Stoodler had hoped. It actually outperformed the T-44 in semi-auto fire, but the rifle had been consigned to cancellation, and it was made so. In addition, all the rifles tested, and especially the T-44, were again consistently noted to be absolutely piss poor when fired on full auto, and it had kinda become painfully clear that the highly sought after, all-in-one lightweight rifle was never going to be a viable automatic weapon. From here, the development of heavy-barreled variants better suited to full auto fire became a priority, while the idea of stripping the base rifles of their automatic function, something already somewhat popular at Springfield, gained ever more traction. Regardless, the Belgian rifle had established itself as the top dog of the trials, and much of the Army, and especially the Army Field Forces Board overseeing the trials, favoured the FAL. But alas, it was a foreign rifle, and to the Ordnance Department, that was unacceptable. Instead, the T-44, now the beneficiary of most of the available funding for the American lightweight rifle program, was revised for additional testing to dethrone the FAL, adding a charging device and a new magazine lifted from John Garand's T-31, alongside the emergence of the heavy-barreled T-44E1 and an unnamed lower-capacity semi-automatic only model. In a matter of months, the new T-44s were created, with assistance from the now-shunned Earl Harvey. Returning to the testing grounds in July 1953, the FAL again greatly outperformed the T-44s. The American rifles were malfunctioning at an alarming rate, something not at all helped by them still being built on T-20E2 receivers from 1945. Quite simply, it was still not good enough. Despite Springfield's best efforts, the more developed FN rifle fit the bill better than the cobbled-together T-44, and by August, the project was facing down the axe. The American rifle program had all but failed, and Stoodler retired on August 31st, 1953, having run his pet program into the ground. The final nail in the coffin was scheduled for the winter, when the T-44 and FAL were slated for their final Arctic conditions test, but it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that the Belgian rifle would be adopted. In fact, that autumn, the Army themselves had preemptively ordered 3,000 FALs in gleeful anticipation of its adoption. It was a bleak outcome for a program that had once been so promising, but Springfield wasn't giving up just yet. This was it, one last chance to save their lightweight rifle from certain doom. And as luck would have it, they were saved, just not in a way any of them could yet imagine. Time was quickly running out for the T-44, and by extension the Ordnance Department's pride, so a daring modification program was rapidly undertaken to bolster the T-44's chances. The magazine was improved to reduce friction, a new winter trigger was added, the stock strengthened with a metal liner, and Earl Harvey even developed a new gas plug for the weapon. Testing of the rifle resolved a number of issues with dusty and cold environments, and by December 1953, the improved T-44 arrived in Alaska for what many thought would be its funeral. But that isn't what happened. Although it was essentially still a glorified T-20E2 with a few bits cannibalized from other rifle programs, the T-44 had been effectively refined, and now it was the FAL that had completely shit the bed. The Belgian rifle had several violent parts breakages in the cold, breakages that were so bad the co-designer of the FAL had to personally come to resolve the issues, but instead his fix only made them worse. It was not a good look for the Belgians, and because the T-44 wasn't violently breaking, it had been miraculously spared the same death sentence as the T-47. By the end of testing, the T-65E3 round had been officially adopted as the 7.62 by 51mm NATO, but the anticipated standardization of the FAL was put on ice following its cold weather calamities, giving the Americans some much-needed breathing room. The T-44 was revised once more into the T-44E4, now utilizing its own dedicated receiver after nearly a decade of using rechambered T-20E2s. Finally. It also included some minor improvements to the gas system, but most notably, by late 1954, it was almost universally agreed that full auto fire on the T-44 was a waste of time, and plans to restrict it entirely had begun to solidify. Meanwhile, the FAL was reproduced commercially in the US as the T-48 for the final rounds of testing. Venturing once more into the Arctic, the trials during winter 1954-55 showed the T-44 having a clear edge, mostly due both to the American T-48s being plagued by pervasive industrial hurdles and quality control issues at their commercial manufacturers, as well as the design being considerably more sensitive to dusty environments. So dire were these issues that further testing was scarce throughout 1955 until spring of 1956, when the final trial was ordered. It had been over a decade since the program had begun, and NATO, and I'm sure you watching this too, just wanted a rifle to be chosen at this point. For the final time, the T-44 and FAL faced off. And as per usual, the final decision became as much about politics as it was the rifles themselves. What were supposed to be the most in-depth and advanced tests of any rifles ever undertaken quickly devolved into a much more rushed process. Again, this program had been 11 years in the making, and pretty much everyone was sick of it. Despite being shortened and hastened, testing at Fort Benning and Quantico still took several months, and when all was said and done, the results remained as contested as ever. Both rifles performed excellently, showing significant improvement since their first trials, but the T-44 had leapt ahead in terms of reliability. The American FAL was still experiencing severe parts breakages and had a 2.4% malfunction rate compared to the T-44's 1.4%. Finally though, for the first time since the T-20E2 was recommended for adoption back in 1945, a rifle had been found which was deemed suitable for Army use. Unfortunately though, that rifle was both of them. This is where those good old political considerations come back into play, because now the Pentagon could justifiably adopt the American rifle, even if that meant breaking the deal they'd made with the Brits back in '52. The T-44E4 being homegrown and much more reliable was enough to make it the clear first choice for the US military. And to bolster its profile, it was claimed, highly dubiously, that the rifle's many similarities to the Garand would simplify both manufacturing and training. There were some other genuinely compelling reasons for choosing it over the T-48 though. The T-44E4 was lighter, had half as many parts, and had excellent parts interchangeability. But also, Ordnance had just spent 11 years and God knows how much in taxpayer money developing their rifle. To abandon it now would be political suicide. Moreover, production of the T-48 was still causing headaches. And well, it's not exactly ideal to adopt a foreign rifle you can't adequately build yourself. While it was kind of inevitable that the T-44E4 would be adopted given the testing results and politics, it seems that no one wanted to be the guy to make that definitive call, so any announcement of adoption was in bureaucratic limbo for another few months. This delay was also partially because much of the army was sore that they wouldn't get the rifle they wanted. To the surprise of no one though, on May 1st, 1957, the T-44E4 was announced as the M14, with its heavy-barreled brother adopted as the M15. Both were officially classified in November, while the M1 Garand, the BAR, and the M1 carbine they were to replace were reclassified as limited standard. In the US, there was much rejoicing. Across the Atlantic, however, the Europeans were incensed. They had caved on the 7.62 cartridge, and now the promise of a universal NATO rifle had been torn up right in front of them. Much of NATO, if they hadn't already, went on to adopt the FAL regardless, but the dream of a standard rifle would never come to pass. It had been nearly 12 years of development, failure, politics, and favoritism, but finally, the M1 Garand had been replaced, with no shortage of controversy along the way. But controversy had a way of plaguing the M14 from the beginning, and as the new rifle entered service, shit continued to hit the fan at a rate I'm surprised didn't jam it.
The M14 rifle, 7.62mm, is a lightweight shoulder weapon. It is somewhat similar to the M1 rifle in functioning and appearance, but with additional characteristics of other small arms.
That's a tale for another time, because this video is long enough already. So let's wrap this shit up, because this was a convoluted train wreck all around. Underfunded and underdeveloped, the rifle that became the M14 was neither advanced nor forward-thinking. It was an afterthought, a neglected spawn of the wartime T-20E2, that only really got to where it was because Studler's department had dug themselves into a hole and the T-44 was their only way out. For much of the rifle's development, it was barely surviving on the scraps left over from Studler's precious T-47. Yet even when it finally did get some real support, the M14 remained incredibly similar to the M1 it so ungraciously descended from. After supplanting the T-47 as Springfield's horse in the lightweight rifle race, for several years the T-44 primarily battled the venerable FN-FAL, miraculously coming back from the brink of destruction to eclipse the Belgian design in reliability. Given the homegrown T-44's physical advantages, immense political expedience, and lack of production issues, so far, the Americans adopted it as the M14, royally fucking over their NATO allies in the process. Ultimately, the M14 represented everything the Ordnance Department were truly after. It was powerful, it was traditional, and it was American. But their newfound devotion to the M14 soon came at an unfathomable cost. From here, the M14 will, among other things, struggle to even make it into the hands of soldiers, suffer all manner of physical issues, face off against newer, tougher competition, and fight in a war it was barely suitable for. But for now, the M14 had clawed its way into adoption, if only just. This is where the first chapter of the M14 story ends, and thus, so does this video. I need to go touch some grass, and in all likelihood, so do you. As always though, thank you so very much for watching. I'll be back soon with a part 2 for this series and another episode or 2 of the Firearms in 5 series I started a couple weeks back, which if you haven't seen, feel free to go check that out. Sources, as I mentioned before, are in the description if you want to learn more. Anyways, that's all from me for now, thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.